Imagine standing at the intersection of power and wealth, where decisions about who gets what are made not just by the invisible hand of the market, but by very visible human institutions. This is the domain of political economy, where politics and economics aren't separate spheres but intimately connected forces that shape our world. From the mercantile ambitions of colonial empires to today's global economic order, the story of political economy is the story of civilization itself. In the gilded halls of 17th-century Versailles, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, chief minister to Louis, meticulously calculated how many gold coins should flow into France, and how few should be allowed to leave. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, merchants lobbied Parliament for exclusive trading rights that would make their fortunes while filling the crown's coffers. These weren't just economic decisions. They were exercises of political power that would shape nations. Welcome to the fascinating journey through the history of political economy, the study of how wealth and power intertwine to create the world we live in. Political economy, at its core, examines the relationship between politics and economics, how governments and other institutions shape economic outcomes, and how economic forces influence political decisions. Unlike pure economics, which often treats markets as independent systems governed by natural laws, political economy recognizes that markets are created by societies, embedded in political contexts, and shaped by human choices. Our story begins in the 16th century with mercantilism, the dominant economic philosophy of European powers during the Age of Exploration and Colonization. Mercantilists viewed the global economy as a zero-sum game. One nation's gain was another's loss. Thomas Munn, director of the English East India Company and an influential mercantilist writer, argued in his 1664 work, England's Treasure by Foreign Trade, that national wealth depended on maintaining a positive balance of trade, exporting more than importing to accumulate precious metals. Mercantilism wasn't just an economic theory, it was a recipe for imperial power. When the Spanish conquistadors plundered the silver mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, they weren't just seeking wealth, they were executing a national strategy. Between 1545 and 1783, approximately 45,000 tons of pure silver flowed from this single mountain to Spain's coffers. The Spanish monarchy used this wealth to fund its military ambitions and maintain its position as a dominant European power. Other European powers followed suit, establishing colonial empires and trading monopolies. The British East India Company, founded in 1600, wasn't merely a business enterprise. It was an instrument of state power with its own army and the authority to wage war, negotiate treaties, and mint money. When Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, he wasn't just expanding a market, he was laying the groundwork for British domination of the Indian subcontinent for the next 2 centuries. But as the 18th century progressed, a Scottish moral philosopher named Adam Smith began to question these mercantilist assumptions. In his groundbreaking work, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, the same year the American colonies declared independence, Smith argued that wealth came not from hoarding gold, but from increasing productivity through the division of labor and free exchange. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, Smith wrote, but from their regard to their own interest. This famous passage introduced the concept of the invisible hand, the idea that individuals pursuing their self-interest in a free market would, unintentionally, promote the general welfare better than any government planner could. Smith's arguments provided the intellectual foundation for classical political economy, which flourished in Britain during the Industrial Revolution. David Ricardo, a successful stockbroker turned economist, built on Smith's work with his theory of comparative advantage, published in 1817. Ricardo demonstrated that countries benefit from trade even when one is more efficient at producing everything, as long as they specialize in what they do relatively better. These weren't abstract academic debates. When Britain debated repealing the Corn Laws, tariffs on imported grain that protected landed aristocrats, but raised food prices. Ricardo's theories provided ammunition for industrialists who wanted cheaper food for their workers. The repeal in 1846 marked a victory for free trade principles and accelerated Britain's transformation into the workshop of the world. Meanwhile, the brutal realities of industrial capitalism were inspiring a radical critique. In the crowded factories of Manchester, where workers toiled for 14-hour days in dangerous conditions, Friedrich Engels gathered material for his 1845 work, The Condition of the Working Class in England. This vivid account of industrial poverty influenced his collaborator, Karl Marx, who was developing a comprehensive critique of capitalism. In 1848, as revolutionary movements swept across Europe, Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto, declaring that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Their analysis viewed economic systems not as natural phenomena but as products of power relationships that could and should be transformed. Marx's magnum opus, Das Kapital, published in 1867, offered a detailed analysis of capitalism as a system driven by the exploitation of labor. Marx argued that capitalism contained internal contradictions that would eventually lead to its collapse and replacement by socialism. While Marx did not live to see the Russian Revolution of 1917, his ideas profoundly influenced Vladimir Lenin and other revolutionaries who established the Soviet Union, the first state explicitly founded on Marxist principles. The late 19th century also saw the emergence of neoclassical economics, which shifted focus away from the classical economists' concern with economic growth and distribution toward the mathematical analysis of markets in equilibrium. Economists like Alfred Marshall, who published his Principles of Economics in 1890, developed sophisticated models of supply and demand, laying the groundwork for modern microeconomics. But the Great Depression of the 1930s exposed the limitations of neoclassical theory. As industrial production collapsed and unemployment soared to 25% in the United States, the idea that markets would naturally return to equilibrium seemed increasingly dubious. Into this breach stepped John Maynard Keynes, a brilliant British economist whose 1936 work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, revolutionized macroeconomic thinking. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood, Keynes wrote. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. His own ideas would prove this maxim correct, as Keynesian economics provided the intellectual foundation for the New Deal in America and similar programs elsewhere. Keynes argued that during economic downturns, government should step in to stimulate demand through increased spending, even if this meant running budget deficits. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt implemented massive public works programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which employed thousands to build dams and power plants between 1933 and 1945, he was putting Keynesian principles into practice. The post-World War II era saw the rise of the welfare state in many Western countries, with governments taking an active role in managing their economies and providing social safety nets. This embedded liberalism, as political economist John Ruggie later termed it, represented a compromise between free markets and social protection. But by the 1970s, this Keynesian consensus was under strain. Stagflation, the combination of high unemployment and inflation, seemed to contradict Keynesian models. A group of economists associated with the University of Chicago, led by Milton Friedman, began to advocate for monetarism, the view that controlling the money supply should be the primary focus of economic policy. Friedman's 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom, articulated a vision of limited government and free markets that would become influential in the 1980s. When Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates dramatically in 1979 to 1981 to combat inflation, even at the cost of triggering a severe recession, he was putting monetarist principles into practice. The elections of Margaret Thatcher in the UK in 1979 and Ronald Reagan in the US in 1980 marked a decisive shift toward neoliberalism, a political economic philosophy emphasizing deregulation, privatization, and free trade. As Thatcher famously declared, there is no alternative to market-oriented reforms. When she took on the powerful coal miners' union in 1984-85 and won, she demonstrated the political will to remake the British economy along neoliberal lines.
You're just scratching the surface of political economy. There's so much more unfolding right now. More insights, more depth, more revelations. As we dive into Adam Smith and the birth of capitalism, Karl Marx's critique, mercantilism, Keynesian economics, neoliberalism, and more, broken down clearly, explored from every angle, so check the links in the description. Click, explore, and go deeper. And don't forget to subscribe for more.
The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 seemed to confirm the triumph of market capitalism. Francis Fukuyama's essay, The End of History, captured the zeitgeist, suggesting that liberal democracy and free market capitalism represented the final form of human government. When China embraced market reforms under Deng Xiaoping while maintaining Communist Party control, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty in the process, it seemed to further validate the power of markets, if not liberal democracy. But the global financial crisis of 2008 exposed vulnerabilities in the neoliberal model. When investment bank Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, it triggered a cascade of failures that threatened the entire global financial system. Governments that had championed deregulation suddenly found themselves nationalizing banks and insurance companies to prevent economic collapse. The U.S. government's $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, signed by President George W. Bush in October 2008, represented an extraordinary intervention in markets that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The crisis also revived interest in the work of economists who had warned about financial instability, such as Hyman Minsky. His financial instability hypothesis, developed in the 1960s but largely ignored during the boom years, suddenly seemed prescient. Minsky had argued that periods of prosperity encourage increasingly risky financial behavior, eventually leading to crisis, what commentators now called a Minsky moment. In the aftermath of the crisis, new approaches to political economy gained prominence. Thomas Piketty's monumental study, Capital in the 21st Century, published in 2013, documented rising inequality and warned that capitalism naturally tends toward concentration of wealth unless counteracted by policy. When his data showed that the top 10% of Americans owned over 70% of national wealth, it sparked renewed debates about distribution and power. Meanwhile, feminist political economists like Nancy Folber challenged conventional measures of economic activity that excluded unpaid care work predominantly performed by women. In her 2001 book, The Invisible Heart, Folber argued that mainstream economics systematically undervalued the caring labor essential to human well-being and social reproduction. Environmental political economists pointed to the fundamental contradiction between unlimited economic growth and the finite resources of our planet. When the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned in its 2018 report that humanity had just 12 years to limit catastrophic climate change, it highlighted the urgent need to reconsider economic systems that depend on fossil fuels and endless consumption. Institutional political economists like Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson explored how political institutions shape economic outcomes. Their influential 2012 book, Why Nations Fail, argued that inclusive political and economic institutions, those that distribute power broadly and enable participation, are key to prosperity. When they contrasted North and South Korea, nations with similar cultures and resources but radically different institutions and economic outcomes, they demonstrated the crucial importance of political arrangements for economic development. Today's political economy landscape is diverse and vibrant, with scholars drawing on insights from multiple traditions to understand our complex world. The COVID-19 pandemic has prompted renewed attention to the role of government in addressing market failures and providing public goods like healthcare. The rise of digital platforms has raised new questions about monopoly power and regulation in the information age. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, from climate change to inequality to technological disruption, the insights of political economy remain essential. By understanding the complex interplay between politics and economics throughout history, we gain valuable perspective on our present dilemmas and possible futures. The story of political economy is ultimately the story of how societies organize to meet human needs and desires. From the mercantilist empires of the 17th century to today's global capitalism, this story reveals that economic arrangements are never purely technical matters, but reflect fundamental choices about power, values, and the kind of society we wish to create. As Adam Smith recognized nearly 250 years ago, economics is a moral science, concerned not just with efficiency, but with justice. As we navigate our uncertain future, the rich tradition of political economy reminds us that we have choices about how to organize our economic lives and that these choices matter profoundly for human flourishing and the health of our planet.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.